Welcome back, everyone, to our audience here and online. We're ready to begin our third session this afternoon, starting with our first speaker, Claudia Griego, who will be introduced by her advisor, Laurie Monahan, both joining us from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Welcome.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I mean that sincerely, being here in a space with other people. Somebody told me they were very excited to walk up to the mic. Actually, he may have said it out loud, but I agree. It's really wonderful to be able to talk to everybody. And I want to thank the organizers, Mary Miller, of course, and Rebecca Peabody and Chelsea Anderson, who have made this really come together and have done such a fine job. And I also want to thank our presenters. It's been a really interesting day, and it's not over yet. So one of the things about a conference like this is it really gives people who are used to being sort of senior or talking to colleagues, such a great opportunity to hear what kinds of questions are framing material for young scholars and see what the future of the discipline is. And I'm grateful to all of you, the presenters, for giving us that opportunity. So it's my pleasure to introduce Claudia Griego Marsh, who is a PhD candidate at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And she is a person I have the pleasure of working with as her advisor. She came to UCSB from the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, where she received a master's degree in literature, and she has another master's degree in art history from the Sorbonne, Paris 1. And she's interested in European and Latin American art from following World War II, and particularly the cultural exchanges between artists and writers in Spain in the late Francoist period, and those in revolutionary Cuba and Allende's Chile. She's a recipient of the Albert and Elaine Borchardt Fellowship for Dissertation Research and a UCSB Humanities and Social Science Research Fellowship. So please join me in welcoming Claudia Griego Marsh.
Well, thank you, Laurie, for your introduction and your support. Thank you also to the whole Getty team for organizing today's event. It's been a real pleasure to be here in person and to share all of this knowledge and experience with you, and it's an experience that I will remember forever. And thank you, of course, as well to the staff that it's been involved in actually putting up all of this in-person hybrid mode event. As you see in my title, there's a slight difference to the one that we have in the program. If my subject is not large enough, I've decided to actually also introduce Chile in there. So I hope that actually that's not a problem and that you will actually enjoy today's talk. Between 1960 and 1975, during the so-called developmentalist period of Francisco Franco's dictatorship in Spain, the regime relaxed its censorship policies, allowing for a certain critical leeway among anti-Francoist artists and intellectuals. Gone was the decade of the 1940s, the early years of the dictatorship in which Franco had deemed avant-garde art as amoral and aberrant. Throughout the 1950s, the regime had started using modern art as a tool of cultural diplomacy to internationally project a renovated image of the country. While the control, persecution, and imprisonment of anyone who openly showed their opposition to the government would continue until the death of the dictator in 1975, during the 60s, Franco adopted an institutional semi-tolerance that provided a certain freedom of political expression to the post-Civil War generation of Spanish avant-garde artists. During the last years of the dictatorship, explicit critique of the regime was still prohibited, but its more relaxed censorship policies permitted politicized artists such as Picasso, Antoni Tapias, or the pop art group Equipo Crónica to formulate new strategies of contestation. One such strategy consisted of staging their solidarity with the political struggles of diverse collectives in Spain and around the world. As you can see on the image on the left, here, Spanish anti-Francoist artists created artworks supporting labor groups, like, for example, the miners from Asturias in 1962. They participated in students' demonstrations and gatherings, like the so-called Capuchinada in Barcelona, to endorse claims for political assembly and self-organization. And they created artworks that reflected on or denounced local and international political conflicts, like the Vietnam War. Amid these burgeoning forms of artistic solidarity, there was one international political cause that especially drew the attention of the Spanish intellectuals. Latin American socialism, as the Spaniards called it, and especially the governments of Fidel Castro's Cuba and Salvador Allende's Chile, became their model. Meeting with Allende in Chile, as the latter accepted a loan from the Francoist government. However, despite their strategic alliances with Franco, Castro and Allende also maintained very good relations with the Spanish Communist Party, which was still a clandestine organization in Franco's Spain. On the right, you see Dolores Ibarruri, also known as La Pasionaria, one of the most important Spanish Communist Party leaders, speaking with Fidel Castro in Cuba in 1963. While the Spanish Communist Party became the main organization for anti-Francoist opposition during the dictatorship, anti-Francoist artists did not necessarily align with the party due to its cultural and artistic policies, which restricted avant-garde production, accepting mainly social realist style. Due to this seemingly contradictory ideological relation between Franco and the Latin American governments, Spanish intellectuals opposed to Franco were able to express their solidarity with Cuba and Chile. From the early 1960s throughout the late 1970s, Spanish art critics and artists such as the abstract painter Antonio Saura, the new figuration painter Eduardo Arroyo, or the art critic José María Moreno Galván signed letters of solidarity, such as the one you see on the left. They participated in publishing projects that praised the revolution, like the illustrated book España Canta Cuba, Spain Sings to Cuba, which you see on the center, and donated artworks to Cuban and Chilean institutions. On the right, for instance, you see one of the artworks that the Spanish painter Josep Guinovar donated to Allende's government in Chile, making explicit reference to Picasso's Guernica. Artists like Ángel Aragonés or Antonio Miró even portrayed Fidel Castro or Salvador Allende, relying as well on military imagery or images of police repression. However, while the Spaniards' efforts genuinely expressed their solidarity with what they saw as progressive regimes, their conception of their Latin American peers was complicated by the legacy of Spain's colonial past. The transatlantic alliances that the Spaniards built with Latin America were sustained by a logic of identification and othering in which Franco's conception of pan-Hispanism still underlay their ideological frame. Spanish solidarity drew on the recasting of Chile and Cuba as symbols of creative and political liberty, an ideal that the Spaniards opposed to Franco strongly identified with. Yet, these countries were simultaneously seen from the paternalist and exoticizing perspective that at that time Francoism revived. To examine this paradox between identification and imperialist othering toward Cuba and Chile, my research departs from recent scholarly trends that rely on empathy as a central concept of analysis for studies of art and political solidarity. Rather, I look at the way in which the Spaniards enacted their solidarity, not only represented it, while analyzing the mosaic of attractions and repulsions that grounded their alliances. In this way, my work is indebted to Michael Tausig's analysis of mimesis, as well as the mechanisms of identification and alterity he has substantially explored. I draw on Tausig's argument that any perception of similarity is performed and sustained by a particular politics of alterity. In the Spaniards' case, this usually unacknowledged performative dimension would be determined by their possibility to frequently travel to Chile and Cuba, while their politics of alterity would be marked by their paternalistic fascination for both countries. A key expression of the Spaniards' solidarity was the fact that they were able to be physically present in Cuba and Chile. On Saura's first trip to Cuba in 1966, when he first experienced the reality of the Cuban situation, the painter declared, quote, "The revolution is much more impressive than I thought. It is incredibly splendid. You cannot imagine it or describe it. Only by touching it, you can feel the amazement that I feel right now." End quote. Experiencing the socialist reality in person, as we are here today, had a very special value that could not be grasped otherwise. Through the frequent travels to Cuba and Chile, the Spaniards were able to live a political and cultural reality built on the socialist ideas that they believed in and that were completely at odds with Franco's Spain. During the 1960s, these artists, writers, and critics repeatedly participated in exhibitions and attended conferences organized by Casa de las Américas, the most important cultural institution in Cuba. They took part in government-sponsored events, such as the Salon de Mai of 1967, or the Cultural Congress of Havana in 1968. During these visits, artists such as the painters Lucio Muñoz, Arroyo, or Saura established close alliances with the Cuban intellectuals and performed some of their functions. They published works and articles in the most important magazines of the countries. You have here an example of Antonio Saura's cover for the magazine El Caimán Barbudo. They were allowed to create artworks in public spaces, like the Archive of the Revolution in Havana. Perhaps unsurprisingly, their artwork was even publicly interpreted, referencing the artists' anti-Francoist stance, echoing the opposition to the dictatorship that was popular amongst the Cuban intelligentsia. In an interview conducted to Arroyo in 1967, published by Gramma, the official newspaper of the Cuban Communist Party, the artist described how intense the revolutionary landscape was on the island, and, I quote, "praised the country's freedom and the many possibilities that it offered to intervene in activities that were not necessarily artistic." Along similar lines, in 1971, the art critic José María Moreno Galván, who is seen here meeting with the critic Mario Pedrosa, published an article in the Spanish magazine Triunfo, where he documented his trip to Chile that same year. In this text, Moreno Galván intensely admired the freedom that he had found and enjoyed all over the country. The art critic had been invited to participate in the Operación Verdad, Operation Truth in English, a trip organized by President Allende himself for a selected group of European intellectuals to verify the revolution that the country was going through after his rise to power in 1970. As the art critic declared, one could find freedom everywhere in Chile, in their books, in their behavior, in the ways in which they communicated, all of which were part of what he called the philosophy of the Chilean population. In the speech that Moreno Galván gave at the inaugural event of the Operación Verdad, he highlighted his experience of liberty. I quote, "In Chile, I have the feeling of being a free man, even if I still have some restrictions that weigh on me," end quote. These restrictions that Moreno Galvan mentioned made reference to his incarceration the previous year, due to a speech he had given in a students' assembly in Madrid against Spain's social and cultural repression. During his trip to Chile, Moreno Galvan came up with the idea of creating a modern art museum in Santiago, envisioning a collection produced with donations from hundreds of artists around the world. Inaugurated in 1972 under the name of Museo de la Solidaridad Salvador Allende, Museum of Solidarity Salvador Allende, Moreno Galvan convinced dozens of Spanish artists to contribute, including Joan Miró, as you can see on screen, Manolo Millares, or Eduardo Chillida. By traveling to both countries, the Spanish artists and critics could enact the creative freedom they longed for, which for them was also synonymous with social freedom. In Cuba and Chile, they participated in events demonstrating their allegiance with Cuban communists and Chilean socialists. You are seeing here the mural that was produced during the Salon de Mai that was named the Great Spiral and was like collectively painted. This is actually, I wanted to explain it because it's not an evident image. This is actually a zenithal point of view of the artist painting. You can see here like the arms. The Spaniards created and exhibited their work without political interference, and they even collaborated in the creation and consolidation of cultural institutions that were meant to build socialism. During their visits to Cuba and Chile, the Spaniards enacted the ideal of liberty that socialism promised, that they identified with, and that they were prohibited from pursuing in their home country. Their physical presence, marking their solidarity, allowed them to momentarily cancel the distance between their own reality and that of Chile and Cuba, and behave as if they did not have to deal with the creative and expressive limitations that the Francoist regime imposed. Traveling to Chile and Cuba strengthened the Spaniards' conviction that both countries accomplished the social, political, and cultural liberty that socialism aspired to. Reinforcing such beliefs, during their stays, Moreno Galvan, Arroyo, or Saura took part in tours organized by the Cuban and Chilean governments. These planned trips were designed to immerse the artists in the lived realities of each country, taking them to both rural and industrialized areas, such as tobacco factories and reed beds in Cuba, and vineyards and agricultural cooperatives in Chile. However, the ways in which the Spaniards talk about the aspects of Chilean and Cuban societies that they discovered during such trips reveal that they still regarded these countries from a perspective of cultural superiority, despite the admiration and solidarity they professed. For instance, in a 1971 article that Moreno Galvan published documenting this trip to Chile, his declarations were filled with surprise at discovering an unexpected degree of civilization. The art critic narrated how, together with the other intellectuals that accompanied him, he had, I quote, verified that even if Chile was a poor country, it was, and it is, thank God, a country of wine, end quote. Moreno Galvan continued, quote, a lot of us thought that a country that produced wine had to be a civilized country. It was indeed. What a wonder of people, end quote. The art critic found astonishing that Chile could be what he named as a country of dialogue, when cafes, which he considered as a necessary institution for civilized discourse, did not exist. Moreno Galvan's surprise and wonder at the remarkably cultivated and well-behaved Chilean people was imbued with an ethnocentrism that, as Paul Gilroy has argued, participates in the assumption that every human being should be or aspire to be essentially Western. From this perspective of cultural superiority, Moreno Galvan recognized himself as a, and I quote, newcomer from Europe, engaged in the discovery of the unknown Chilean country. Using a vocabulary and an epic tone similar to the imperialist semantics that Franco also used to reivindicate the Hispanicity of what he perceived as the former Latin American colonies, Moreno Galvan explained that the first thing that one had to do when arriving to Chile was to go on, I quote, expeditions around the Chilean reality, end quote. During these expeditions, a term that echoed the Francoist recuperation of the heroic conquest by then intensely exploited through movies, literature, and theater production, the Spaniard was always, I quote, at the mercy of the Chilean people's smiles, end quote. Without acknowledging it, the art critic reproduced the colonial encounter between the seductive savage and the adventurous missionary that Francoism also proudly promoted. In this sense, although Moreno Galvan did not use the explicit primitivist and colonial terms that the regime employed when discussing Latin American people, he did participate in some of the ideological principles of its discourse. He assumed a civilization-driven narrative that decolonial scholars such as Aníbal Quijano or Walter Mignolo have pointed out as one of the underlying power discourses of coloniality, as well as the paternalism with which Franco still treated Spain's old colonies. These assumptions would also be present in some of Sauda's impressions of his trips to Cuba. In an interview from 1966, the artist also expressed his fascination with the spontaneity and freshness of the Cuban people and artists. When asked what had surprised him the most about the island, Sauda emphasized how strange the creative freedom of the Cuban artist was, comparing to the exoticism of Cuban women. I quote, "Those mulatas, my God, those mulatas. I think, and I truly believe it, that the mulata is one of the best things on the planet," end quote. As he stated, the fascination he felt for Cuban painting was the same one he felt for those mulatas. He explicitly objectified, sexualized, and racialized. While the idea of liberty that Latin American socialism advocated was a central element of the Spanish identification with the cause, its materialization in the cultural and social realities of Cuba and Chile was seen from a captivating and picturesque perspective that curiously aligned with Franco's imperialism. Creative and political freedom was what the Spaniards most supported, idealized, and enacted during their trips to Chile and Cuba. Simultaneously, these artists unwittingly replicated the paternalism that the dictator professed towards both countries. The identification their solidarity drew on did not become an actual form of domination, as in the case of colonialism as it emerged, but neither did it represent a relationship of equality. While the Spaniards' alliance with Cuba and Chile supported their anti-imperialist and decolonial fight, the Spaniards could not totally escape the imperialist traces that still permeated the Francoist discourse. From this perspective, the supposed empathy that motivated their solidarity would be better considered, as Tausig names it, as a strange complicity, in which the politics of alterity that the Spaniards' understanding of Latin America were anti-imperialist and imperialist at the same time. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
So once again, I'm Vanessa Schwartz from USC, and I want to join the chorus of voices to once again acknowledge our appreciation to the Getty and the Getty Research Institute for hosting this event and being committed, especially I think to the kind of mentorship that's on display here today, not only with the students from the Atlanta Consortium and Cheryl Finley bringing them here from far away. Many people haven't been on a plane in a long time, but also to acknowledge not only the role and the privilege of directing dissertations, but also I want to shout out that we all know it takes a village to raise a graduate student, and so many colleagues here who are also professors in various departments who are here supporting the students in the department. And I think it's really, it's a great testament to what we actually do. And so before I introduce our speaker, I just want to kind of conclude this little appreciation moment by citing the great American lyricist Oscar Hammerstein, who said that it's a very ancient saying, but a true and honest thought, that if you become a teacher, by your pupils you'll be taught. And I speak, I think, for everyone here who teaches, that knows that from experience. So my privilege today is to introduce Isabel Frampton Wade, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Southern California in art history, and who has also received the Visual Studies Graduate Certificate. Last night at dinner, Mary Miller said, "Does anyone ever start in one period and move backwards in time?" And I didn't have an answer for her last night, but the answer is Isabel. Isabel actually came to USC from the University of Chicago, where she had written an honors thesis on the artist Judy Fiskin, the photographer Judy Fiskin, and she, however, has moved, in a sense, backwards out of what you'd call purely contemporary history of photography. Her dissertation is titled Glossy Buildings, Planned Images, Architectural Photography Across Contested Spaces in Los Angeles, 1938 to 1981. And the project considers how architectural photography visualized and contributed to urban development, to social change, and also to community upheaval. And she also emphasizes the role of professional and commercial photography, in a sense, in that period, and of course, that helps form what you might even call a prehistory of such movements as new topographics, in which, fine art movements. So she really shows the connection between commercial photography and fine art photography as well, and I think that's one of her great contributions. She has received many grants and fellowships, and I'll just mention here that she was awarded the Henry Luce ACLS Fellowship, the Huntington Library Fellowship, the Center for Creative Photography, and she's also, again, benefited from the presence of the Getty. She's been a research assistant here working on the Ruche project as well, and I think this is another moment to signal that the Getty manages to not only provide us the greatest library for art historians in the city, but to welcome us as Californians here as the kind of, in a sense, we're always foreigners here at the Getty, but today it's for us, and helps us understand that we are a community here in California as well, and that we're really privileged to have this kind of great Olympic village on the hill. So with that, I just want to now turn the podium over to Isabel. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for that kind introduction, and I want to echo everyone's thanks to everyone at the Getty for putting together this day and this dinner last night. It's been so generative for me, and I think everyone else as well. I'd like to begin with a question in the form of a poem, seen at right, and a photograph of a sink on a wide wooden pedestal within an orderly room, seen at left. This full-page sepia-toned photograph appears in the experimental exhibition catalog and single-issue magazine called Junk Art, part of artists Noah Purifoy and Judson Powell's 66 Signs of Neon project, which ran from 1966 to 69, considered the first artistic response to the watershed 1965 Watts Uprising. Taken by their friend, professional architectural photographer Harry Drinkwater, the photograph shows Purifoy's piece titled The Sink. Rather than appearing like a strange or slightly battered anomaly, the sink seems to fit right in. A spatial and linear continuity extends from it to the fashionable armchair, lamp, and painting. Through both the sepia photo and the original black and white photograph at left, the assemblage sculpture, in fact, is drawn into a visual framing familiar with Drinkwater's architectural photographs of interior design. Could this be the new way of seeing things that Purifoy envisioned in his verse? 66 Signs of Neon was a response to events that began the evening of August 11th, 1965, when the LAPD pulled over Marquette Frye and his brother on suspicions of drunk driving. Frustration over decades of disenfranchisement and police oppression in Watts came to a head, and violence ebbed and flowed over 6 days, leaving many people dead and resulting in millions in material damages. The Watts Uprising is remembered for the enormity of violence, especially violence enacted by the National Guard against the primarily Black community, for the lack of material change that it catalyzed, and for the significance of class stratification among Black Angelenos that it further exposed. After the uprising, Purifoy, who had been the director of the Watts Tower Arts Center, and Powell ventured through Watts, gathering over 3 tons of debris and remains from buildings, signs, and streets. The material formed the foundation of 66 Signs of Neon, a sculptural and visual re-envisioning of Watts after the uprising. Featuring collaborative works by 8 artists, the exhibition consisted of 66 sculptural assemblages comprised of architectural junk wreckage. When exhibited, 66 Signs of Neon was shown alongside blown-up news photographs taken during the uprising, which were selected by Harry Drinkwater. Tasked with deciding, in his words, the project's concept, Drinkwater photographed the sculptures and the exhibition as it was installed at Los Angeles venues. He also acted as a quasi-project manager for junk art, finding printers and designers and helping with its arrangement. 66 Signs of Neon has been analyzed as a positive message of uplift for the Black community of Watts, and also as a critical reflection on the white bourgeois lifestyle cultivated by California modern design culture. Why then does Drinkwater's photograph of the sink seem to eschew criticality, instead subsuming the sculpture into the interior, making both appear rather orderly? Put otherwise, what difference might it make that a professional architectural photographer served as the primary recorder of an experimental art project? My talk focuses on Drinkwater's documentation in order to demonstrate the significance of photography to 66 Signs of Neon, and to assert that his photographs expose the ambivalent visual responses to the status of Black identity both in the project and in Los Angeles in the 1960s. I argue that Drinkwater's photographs of 66 Signs of Neon reworked and reaffirmed formal and ideological tenets of architectural photography in order to visually manage the junk and disorder on display. In the junk art exhibition catalog, Purifoy expressed that, quote, "The assemblage of junk illustrated for artists the imposition of order on disorder, the creation of beauty from ugliness," end quote. I would suggest that it was Drinkwater's photographs, rather than the sculptures themselves, that achieved the order Purifoy and his project attempted. My larger dissertation considers how commercial architectural photography and its professional community of photographers visualized and contributed to such things as urban redevelopment, community upheaval, and within Los Angeles from the period of 1938 to 1981. During this 40-year period, marked on one end by the foundation of LA's Housing Authority, which catalyzed a new commitment to public housing, and on the other by the city's bicentennial, an event that provoked the public to reflect on past decades. Magazine editors, city planners, architects, and artists increasingly hired architectural photographers to illustrate and to give form to realized and conceptual plans for the city. Architectural photography, my dissertation argues, modeled how to resolve one of the main contentions of urban growth, that is, increasing racial and economic segregation, by managing its subjects through orderly yet dynamic composition. Professional architectural photography's subject matter is often narrowly associated with a pretty limited range of these beautiful portraits of building exteriors and interiors, and I'm sure several come to mind. The genre, however, encompassed quite a capacious field of images. Drinkwater's architectural photography, like his colleagues, lies at the intersection of sculptural photography, urban landscape photography, and even exhibition installation photography, all professional and commercial practices. These genres, far from being anomalous assignments for architectural photographers, are central to understanding the professional field. Tracing how Drinkwater's photographs reconstituted the arguments of 66 Signs of Neon provides a new perspective on how professional architectural photography intervened on its commissions, metabolizing the conflicts and contingencies of projects and exhibitions that were not resolved in the objects or spaces themselves. One of the only professional Black photographers in the city at the time, Drinkwater began working in the late 1940s after finishing school at the Fred Archer School of Photography. He took photographs for two Black-run newspapers, the California Eagle and the Sentinel, and also worked freelance, photographing design, staged rooms, and urban redevelopment for landscape architect Garrett Ekbo, and did much work for interior designer John H. Smith, who designed the interiors of John Lautner's iconic Chemisphere house, seen here at left. Drinkwater became connected with several Black designers and architects through Paul Revere Williams, which is how he met Purifoy. Understudied in histories of photography, with many of his photographs lost, actually, or existing only as negatives, and many are held at the Getty Research Institute, Drinkwater's career reveals how seemingly dissimilar architects, designers, and artists shared a reliance on architectural photography to provide legibility to the relationship in Los Angeles between urban redevelopment, race, and civil conflict. While my larger work on Drinkwater considers photography within the junk art exhibition catalog, an object that was made in order to sell copies to fundraise for a permanent building for the Watts Tower Art Center, the remainder of my talk I'll focus on Drinkwater's exhibition installation photographs, which are mostly confined to archives, and they are the only record of Purifoy and Powell's use of news photographs in the exhibition. The blown-up news photos included a range of depictions of the uprising taken both during and after. And Drinkwater's installation photographs carefully managed the relationship between the objects in the show. In the photos, the particularities of the junk material and the details of the news photos both lose clarity and give way to the order of the space of installation, conditioned by the photographic frame. Architectural photography in general must often self-efface by disguising its own mechanisms of visual framing in order to produce the most accurate or flattering sense of spatial and objects' relations in a scene. But in aligning with such formal approaches, Drinkwater's photographs ask us to consider the relationship between photography and its memorialization of events. If 66 Signs of Neon was, in its creator's words, a response to the uprising, we must consider how the installation photographs formed a fundamental part of such a response. The terms used to characterize the effects of the Watts uprising on Los Angeles, such as formlessness, fragmentation, disorientation, disorder, were also terms through which urbanists, historians, and architects associated visual appearance with social conditions in United States cities in the 1960s. These terms held true particularly in Los Angeles, a city that has been deemed by filmmaker Tom Anderson the most photographed and least photogenic city in the world. As Lisa Udden has recently pointed out with regard to 66 Signs of Neon, such terms often insinuated an anti-Black and classist attitude which associated junk and disorder primarily with Black neighborhoods. The supposed fear of formlessness also conveyed an anxiety, I suggest, that concerned the role of the medium of photography. The spectacle of news media that spread during and after the uprising constituted a direct threat to the photographic representability of the city because such sensationalized imagery of rioting and violence on the streets of Watts trafficked in what Nicole Fleetwood has termed the troubling presence of Blackness on dominant modes of visuality. As Black life in Watts was visualized and could not be ignored, therefore, it seemed that photography might no longer be capable of giving form to a city whose dominant representations had depended on the suppression and narrowly controlled presentation of such visuality. Photographic disorder then would catalyze a collapse of social order. So not only did artists and urbanists try to visually recompose Los Angeles both before and after the uprising, but they relied on architectural photography and professionals such as Drinkwater to give such conceptual projects both legibility and a new order after disorder. In a photograph taken at the exhibition's installation, likely at UCLA, sculptor Max Neufeldt's Max Untitled is placed in front of a blown-up copy of a photograph featured in the Los Angeles Times post-Watts coverage. Beside the photograph is a collage, and below it is Debbie Brewer's Sunflowers. In this particular image, Max Untitled partially blocks the LA Times photograph. Drinkwater's installation photograph, from one perspective, seems to position the news photographs as a sort of temporal before, and the assemblage sculptures as the after, suggesting a transformation of the chaos of the uprising seen in the photos into a new orderly beauty as described by Purifoy in Junk Art. Reviews from exhibition visitors complicate this reading, however, because they often focused on the ugliness of the sculptures and their material, on how the artist's distortion of the charred material was even worse than the effects of the uprising on the neighborhood. Photography, I contend, intervened to transform the junk and the meaning of the uprising, where the sculptures perhaps did not. Some of the LA Times photo blow-ups were reused from the exhibition's installation at the Watts Easter Week Arts Festival, the first venue at which 66 Signs of Neon was displayed. An unattributed photograph from the festival shows a different view of the LA Times photo, and it underscores an alternate approach to documenting the exhibition from Drinkwater's. In it, a toddler stares upward, his mouth somewhat agape. None of the assemblage sculptures are visible, and the dynamics of looking in this photo are pronounced. The toddler looks at the photo, the woman within the LA Times photo seems to look back towards him, and a face in the photograph below the toddler seems to look out at him. The photograph immobilizes these glances of recognition between image and person, removing sculptures entirely from the relationship of visualizing the after effects of the uprising. The photograph of the toddler underscores how the other installation photos by Drinkwater, by contrast, tempered the visibility of the news photographs as well as their immediate association with racial unrest. Instead, they prioritized the relationship between sculpture and photo rather than the news photos as standalone objects describing the reality of the uprising. This exhibition installation photograph of Drinkwater's draws out the competing representations that demonstrate the lack of resolve concerning the exhibition's relationship to both Blackness and Watts. A white woman facing away from the camera gazes intently at the same set of photographs. In the photograph of the toddler, the Times photo, and the disturbing appearance of the pile of junk of the destroyed building and the street are in high relief, but so is this human response. On the right in Drinkwater's photo, by contrast, we are not given access to the white woman's expression, nor to as detailed a view of her witnessing the news photographs of the uprising. Drinkwater's installation photographs thus engaged with the after effects of the uprising by suggesting a way to impose form on this feared formlessness caused by the uprising. His photographs transformed the chaos and potentially radical disorder of civil unrest captured in news photographs of the uprising into a balanced and measured order. Ariella Azulay has argued that photography can show that, quote, the perpetrator and the victim in a regime-made disaster do not exist in separate worlds, end quote. For Azulay, photographs of state-sanctioned police violence, such as that of racial unrest in 1960s United States cities, can beneficially provoke a consideration of the intertwinement of citizens and state power, revealing a more complex picture than that of victim and aggressor. Likewise, what would otherwise seem like straightforward archival documentation of 66 Signs of Neon's installation, in fact, performs this bringing together of different subjects, albeit without any clear resolution of the subject position's relationship to power and to the uprising. In Drinkwater's installation photos, witnessing and responding to the uprising share the scene. The installation photographs do valuable work then, not because they better respond to the uprising than the exhibition itself does, but because they work as occasions on which to reflect on the power of representation to shape and to respond to urban politics. What Drinkwater's photographs ultimately foreground is the state of isolation between the representations on display, the space of exhibition, the artists, and the place of Watts. The visual recuperation of order from disorder, a move accomplished primarily through composition and other formal decisions, had far-reaching consequence for the politics of race and urban change it suggested. The photographs reinforce, rather than resolve, for instance, the tension in Noah Purifoy's decision to align 66 Signs of Neon with the McCone Commission report, which functioned as the official government response to the uprising. Quote, "We thought it a good report, that it advocated most things necessary for the betterment of the community," end quote. The exhibition could, for Purifoy, quote, "establish its validity by becoming an addition to the McCone report," end quote. The McCone report emphasized, among other things, the need for increased police presence in Watts to establish order. It was widely deemed anti-Black and ignorant of community needs. Activist Bayard Rustin proposed, in response to the report's suggestion that recent Black migrants could not handle the difficulties of city life, that it was conversely cities which had been totally unprepared to meet the conditions of Black life. Although meant as a criticism when Susan Sontag asserted in 1977 that photography is essentially an act of non-intervention, Drinkwater's photographs articulate how professional photographic practices nonetheless did something with their position. They made visible the regrettable limits of art's intervention in the face of such racial power structures. Thus, Sharon Slowinski's observation that responsible looking begins when one realizes the limitations of photography's ability to act or to make viewers take action articulates how architectural photography, such as Drinkwater's, could constitute a political act through its very distancing and capacity for reflection. Drinkwater's photographs document the shifting terrain of Black subjecthood in and beyond Watts within 66 Signs of Neon, revealing how architectural photography, meant to illustrate artists' and designers' objects, could in fact unearth the very tensions it was meant to resolve. Drinkwater's photographs leave the presence of Blackness and the visuality ascribed to Black identity in the project without a resolved subject position and without a unified way of being seen. If Purifoy's verse, with which this paper began, suggested new ways of seeing as an abstract concern of 66 Signs of Neon, Drinkwater's photographic contribution worked through the poem's rhetorical prompt by using the language of professional architectural photography in order to renegotiate ways of seeing Watts. Yet the sculptures and photos and other objects pictured nevertheless resist such legibility, suggesting that photography as a tool for visual ordering would falter when encountering the racial complexities of life in United States cities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, Rebecca, and Chelsea, and the Getty, for inviting us all together. My name is Elena Williams, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of California, San Diego. It is my pleasure to introduce Shoaib Halajian. Sho is a curator, co-director of the nonprofit art space Human Resources LA, and co-editor of the online journal Georgia, which is supported by the Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant. She is a PhD candidate in art history, theory, and criticism with a specialization in critical gender studies at UC San Diego, and she is a visiting lecturer in the Department of Art at Williams College. Informed by her curatorial work with artists, Sho's primary research focuses on the history and theory of contemporary art, with an emphasis on the racial and sexual politics of performance art in the United States. Her dissertation, Queer of Color Entanglements, Performative Politics and Coalition Building in Contemporary Art, focuses on sites of political and social resistance in queer performance, prioritizing the way it convenes and engages queer of color communities in New York and Los Angeles. In 2015, she organized the exhibition, I Have Never Been Here Before, by Rafa Esparza, at Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions, where she served as assistant director. Today, Sho will present a segment of her dissertation focusing on Esparza's work. Her talk is entitled Destroying the Form, on the performative politics of Rafa Esparza's bust, A Meditation on Freedom. Please join me in welcoming Sho Halajian.
Give me one moment. Hello. Thank you, Elena, for that generous introduction and for your ongoing support, which is endless. Thank you. And thank you to all the organizers and the participants of today's event. It's really an honor to be part of such a rich program. So I am the final presenter of today's program. And I will present the talk, Destroying the Form, on the performative politics of Rafa Esparza's bust, A Meditation on Freedom. The performance bust, A Meditation on Freedom, is an intervention in the space of detention and incarceration. In the course of the performance, the artist Rafa Esparza is encased in concrete and gravel up to his chest, transformed into the image of a portrait bust, and then tasked with the arduous work of breaking himself free. Wearing a dark button-up shirt and a matching tie, he chips away at the solid concrete plinth for hours with only a hammer and chisel. Taking the likeness of a displayed bust that is now undead and animated, he bangs on the concrete. The sharp clanking sound of a hammer hitting a steel chisel repeats over and over. This persistent rhythm marks time. The solid column confines the lower half of the artist's body, leaving his upper half free, that is not interred, yet fixed to the structure and therefore locked into place. For almost 2 hours, Esparza labors, pauses in exhaustion, and then continues on. Rafa Esparza is a multidisciplinary artist who works predominantly in performance and installation. Committed to working in the geographies of the Southwest, Mexico, and Latin America, many of his projects address familial experiences of immigration and the complex diasporic histories of Los Angeles. Esparza's public performances intervene into the built environment, activating contested sites of dispossession and legislative violence. These include a series of solo and collaborative performances at the Los Angeles River, the Santee Alley shopping area in downtown Los Angeles,
and numerous performances at Elysian Park, formerly known as Chavez Ravine, which is well known for its 1950s history of displacement of Mexican-American families for the construction of Dodger Stadium. The performance bus takes place across the street from the Los Angeles Twin Towers Correctional Facility, also known as the Twin Towers Jail, which measures a monumental 1.5 million square feet. Despite its domineering presence and massive concrete brutalist architecture, the structure blends in with nearby administrative government buildings, with the Sheriff's Department and the Central Post Office all within close proximity. This particular area in downtown is a critical hub of activity for the city's transportation network too, with the metro railway lines and the metro offices located just blocks away. Nestled within a network of mass transit and the 110, 101, and 5 freeways, the Twin Towers stands taller than all the surrounding structures. It appears to be plopped down, stubbornly stock still in the middle of so much civic activity. It is the year 2015, and Esparza's performance in front of the Twin Towers Jail comes at a particularly contentious moment in the city when various civic and cultural institutions are debating the County Board of Supervisors' approval of a $2 billion plan to expand the county jail system. The plan includes the redesign of the downtown Men's Central Jail, which is just across the street from the Twin Towers Jail, and the creation of a new women's jail in Lancaster, in northern Los Angeles County. The county has the largest jail system in the world, so the move towards expansion is a deeply polarizing issue. While proponents claim that this expansion will ease overcrowding, critics argue that funding should be reallocated to community services and crisis management programs. 2015 was also noted in the Guardian newspaper as the year with the highest rate of police brutality at that moment. This is 2 years after the founding of the Black Lives Matter movement, through which the issues of police brutality and mass incarceration are growing in mainstream discourse. Therefore, Esparza's bust intervenes into a particularly charged place and time and addresses the spatio-temporal practices of legislative violence through the performance of labor. I explore how Esparza's performative task of busting out conjures up the utopian potential of system-wide abolition and imaginatively entangles this potential with the forging of coalitions across seemingly distinct social spheres. I consider Esparza's public intervention into sites of surveillance, such as the prison, with his interventions into art institutions in relation to the conventions of the white cube. I am interested in the ways in which artists advance a progressive politics by connecting seemingly disparate yet entangled sites of oppression and resistance. In this talk, I ask, what insights does Esparza's performance of emplacement and eventual displacement offer about the body within conditions of confinement and capture? How can we engage with the temporality of performance within a context in which time itself is used as punishment? In a UCLA lecture in 2020, Esparza explained the impetus behind Bust. Quote, "A lot of this work was about my own fear of surveillance, my own fear of the LAPD. So situating myself in such a manner where I could physically see a police officer encounter me was liberating and empowering. This was also an invitation for folks to experience the architecture and design of confinement," end quote. He goes on to describe the jail in downtown Los Angeles, which has speakers on the external facade of the building that project the names of the incarcerated individuals who have visiting guests that day. So if visitors leave the waiting room, they can come back when the person is ready. Quote, "What that sounds like, according to Esparza, is a roll call of mostly Spanish names being projected out into public space, representing to the public the bodies that are being locked up in this jail," end quote. Within the context of prison expansion and the increased policing of brown and black men, architectural space plays a critical role in parsing out the significance of Esparza's performance. Esparza's encased body gives form to the roster of Spanish names being projected outwards. It constructs a metonymic relation between the individual body, his brown and masculine appearing body, to the many who are incarcerated inside, and thereby manifests the gender and racial disparities and policing patterns. This individual to collective formulation quickly moves across varying scales, in which the single individual stands in for the group, here the group being the 17,000 who are imprisoned inside the Twin Towers, and then to a larger scale of the nationwide prison complex totaling 2.3 million today. Esparza's invitation to experience the architecture and design of confinement also points to the various actors who are implicated in the design of confinement. For example, in 2014, 1 year before BUST, the San Francisco-based architects, designers, and planners for social responsibility filed a request to the American Institute of Architects to adopt a rule prohibiting architects from designing buildings for the purpose of, quote, execution, torture, and solitary confinement. While this request was declined, it sheds light on how the built environment and its logics of modern planning and development directly contribute to the marginalization and dehumanization of communities. Esparza centers the materiality of form and building practices and processes in his work as a whole. He primarily works with adobe material to produce installations in gallery settings, most of which are produced collaboratively with the help of family members and friends. In fact, I curated a project with him, as Elena mentioned, during that same year as BUST, in which Esparza transformed the white cube of Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions, a nonprofit space in Hollywood, into what we described as a space absent of corners and made of brown matter, end quote. Art historian Gwyneth Shanks discusses Esparza's use of adobe and dirt as material means of, quote, conjuring ground, making possible the felt experience of a different place and time, in which histories of authority, privilege, masculinity, and whiteness that ground Western museums are obscured by adobe bricks, end quote. While I will not delve into the adobe material in this talk, although I do in my dissertation chapter, I am inspired to meditate on the materiality of BUST, which is concrete. Esparza's use of concrete is a sharp contrast to his works in adobe. Concrete, as we know, is a ubiquitous building material and the most widely used substance on Earth after water. Unlike adobe, concrete is congruous with the built materiality of public space. Concrete also has its own rules, a 10, 20, 30, 40 formula, meaning it needs approximately 10% cement, 20% air and water, 30% sand, and 40% gravel. Once this combination is mixed, one has to lay it out quickly into the form. As it sets or dries, it gets hot. It gets so hot that it can burn skin. In order to protect his body throughout the performance, Esparza wore a denim jumpsuit over his legs and waist, as well as a sheet of thick painter's plastic between him and the encasement's walls. He also had assistants standing by with a pickaxe in case they needed to quickly break him out of the form. So although it is a solo performance, this work is fully dependent on the assistance of others, who also prepared the column and then pried open the wooden armature when the concrete had hardened. Here, two artists, Nancy Popp and Timo Fowler, are helping him prepare the concrete and then later on pry open the walls for him. Contemporary abolitionist scholars discuss the prison as not solely a building, but as a larger ideology of criminalization and imprisonment that extends beyond the prison walls. In her book, Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration, American studies scholar Nicole Fleetwood investigates the impact of the carceral state through the lens of art and visual culture, focusing on works by currently and formerly incarcerated artists. She explores how carceral institutions impact individuals and their loved ones, but also how penal logics shape time, space, and matter itself. she highlights fundamental theories of modern penality, such as how time itself is deployed as punishment, what she calls penal time, or how architectural confinement constructs a set of social relations that exceed far beyond the prison walls, what she calls penal space. Fleetwood challenges the inside and outside logic of carcerality too, claiming, quote, this idea of separation between the incarcerated and the non-incarcerated underpins the rationale of locking people up in cages and rendering them invisible as a measure of safety, end quote. This assertion is particularly important to my reading of Esparza's bust, a performance that figuratively moves the prison walls outside and into public space, and thus collapses the border between free and unfree. Esparza performatively collides two foundational architectural structures together, the prison building and the museum plinth. The plinth, used to present sculpted representations of the human head and chest, serves as a monumentalizing device that reinscribes museological narratives of imperial conquest and patrilineal dominance. The historical convergence of the modern museum and prison is a well-studied thread in art historical scholarship. The discourse emphasizes the ways that both structures manifest a shifting perspective on disciplinarity and model reform based on bourgeois ideals of social acceptability. Nicole Fleetwood states, quote, both prisons and museums were created as technologies of state power to manage and order populations and to cultivate a notion of the citizen subject who would assent or be disciplined, end quote. It is undeniably clear that the museum and prison serve two distinct roles in society and enact oppression on drastically different scales. These institutions, however, embody the extreme bookends of late capitalism, with ruthless dispossession on the one hand and the expenditure of immense capital on the other. The revered bust figure, propped up on a pedestal, is also the subject who is imprisoned inside this form. Blurring the lines between practices of knowledge production and those of enclosure reveals how notions of legibility and visibility, which are normalized by the museum, are differentially distributed in space across racialized and class lines. As a sculptural object, bust invites us to use our bodies and walk around it, and to study it from different angles, letting the form unfold over time, and in that process, disclosing its surroundings to us. From one angle, as I stand against a rusted fence on the sidewalk, I notice the landscape just beyond Esparza. Across the street, there are two commercial bail bond offices, Bad Boys Bail Bonds and Bond Girls Bail Bond. Underneath these marquees, individuals and families walk into these offices. As they pass by, they linger to watch Esparza's performance. The audience of Esparza's site-specific interventions is often the people who routinely occupy the locale in which they are staged. As a result, communities that do not usually intersect are temporarily brought together. This audience, or his audience, is not a complete nor uncomplicated group, but one that temporarily brings together individuals across social divisions. Bust foregrounds the ways that performance can engender interactions across spatially and socially distinct groups. Moving behind the form, I quickly notice how the pillar-like structure mimics various aspects of the Twin Towers building, from the columns at its entrance to the negative space of the countless windows that span its facade. I gradually realized that the rows of narrow slits that circumscribe the Twin Towers' exterior are in fact windows, and that a majority of Esparza's intended audience are those who are incarcerated inside. In an uncanny panopticon reversal, Esparza performs for the possibility of an audience, the possibility that the individuals who are inside the building are following his actions. The speculative gaze haunts the viewing of Esparza's performance and unsettles the criteria of who is included in the category of audience and thereby the public, ultimately raising the question, whose freedom? It asks us to reconsider the limited ways in which the parameters around the public sphere have been uncritically determined, and how this limited scope harms the most vulnerable, in this case, those who are systematically removed from public sites. As I approach the front, I am struck by how tired Esparza appears, how sweat stains and dust have dirtied his shirt, how his body hunches over heavily in order to reach a lower section of the structure now. The endurance of labor also weighs down on the process of engaging with bust as an audience. I stand and watch for almost 2 hours under the LA heat. I feel an empathetic claustrophobia as well as a hypersensitivity to the surrounding landscape. Graffiti on an adjacent wall signals to the transgressions of the law, reminding us of the many restrictions that constitute urban space. The spray-painted letters also point to the everyday practices of creativity that resist state control. The intention, even desire of bust is clear. It works towards a specific goal, which is to get free. The endurance required to fulfill this promise is a laboring process that is enacted by the artist, but also one that is collectively shared throughout the audience. If penal time, to use Fleetwood's terminology, deploys time as punishment, it also employs the notion of the future to justify capture. The state's paranoid management of the future manifests as a narrative of risk management in which certain populations are at risk of breaking the law and therefore must be deterred from committing the imagined harms of the future. As stated by the philosopher Jacques Derrida, the law always predicts its own breach. The future is a critical access point in discourses of queer minoritarian performance, especially in queer theorist José Esteban Muñoz's scholarship, which time and again unveils how marginalized subjects are cast as people without a future, queers who do not have future kin, or racialized subjects who are systematically subject to premature death. Performance, he argues, is a way to envision a future and to rehearse this future in the temporal and spatial coordinates of our world here today. I am interested in thinking about how performance might take back a future, one that is manipulated and used to legitimize state violence. The future functions as a plausible destination point in bust, a horizon that is not far beyond reach. As we watch Esparza chip away at the concrete encasement, we see the structure getting shorter. It is partially destroyed and surrounded by its own detritus now. Bust locates this future in the present moment and in the mundane materiality of concrete. This project resonates with Fleetwood's scholarship, which is a testament to the everyday life forms that evade capture, all the practices of self-expression and sociality that exist inside, across, and despite the prison walls. To experience the architecture and design of confinement, as Esparza invites us to do, is to meditate with bust. After all, this is part of the title, Bust, a Meditation on Freedom. It is to stay put in place and in time, and to imagine how freedom might be in this here and now. After 2 hours, Esparza finally frees himself. The crowd is quiet and somber, then slowly disperses. The rubble and ruins are left behind on the sidewalk, remnants of a future that is already here. Thank you. I will end there.
Thank you very much, Claudia, Isabel, and Shoik, for 3 rich and thought-provoking papers.